Primary school, in my experience, and that's all I can speak for, they're quite small environments, and unless you're moving on to go and be a vice principal or a principal somewhere, you're going to be there for a long time. And kind of the years going to roll in quite quickly, and you can start to lose perspective a wee bit. And I feel like the CPD can be such a wasted opportunity. I mean, I wouldn't be spending too much time talking about the ways to get things like retrieval wrong at this point. I would actually be just really happy if a lot more schools were taken on in the first place.
And I don't think we've ever known as much about how schools improve and how teachers improve as we do now, and it's just about untapping that.
A lot of it then, you sort of think, right, has this been done primarily with the intention of improving teaching and learning, or is it kind of a wee bit of a box ticking exercise?
Welcome to Thinking Deeply About Primary Education, the podcast that makes time and space to think about pedagogy, teaching and learning, professional development, anything of interest to time poor but enthusiasm-rich primary teachers. This week is the second part of my conversation with Matthew Best, all about how we can provide genuinely useful professional development opportunities for teachers, how we can make the science of learning accessible, and where he draws inspiration from when trying to develop his own practice. And so there's lots for us to build on from last week's exploration of effective teaching. Now we're looking at how can we transmit that knowledge from expert teachers, from those who have been doing this for a while, to those who are at the beginning of their journey, so to speak. Without further ado, let's spend some time thinking deeply about primary education. So Matthew, it's great to see you. Thank you very much for coming back. How are you?
I'm not too bad, Kieran. Thanks for having me back again. Glad to be back.
No, not at all. I mean, we only got a little bit into where we wanted to go last week, so I thought let's crack on and keep going, because I think it would be really useful for listeners. I'm sure they'll have all enjoyed the first week, and they're ready and raring for week two.
We could nearly do a 12-week series or something, Kieran, couldn't we, to get through it all? And that wouldn't be enough either.
I mean, who knows what'll happen in September?
Let's wait and see.
So we spoke last week about effective teaching, some of the things that might get in the way, poor proxies for learning. We're almost sort of moving into then, well, how do we support teachers in getting to that point? What do you think genuinely useful PD for primary maths teachers might look like? And I suppose specifically in the context of Northern Ireland and the curricular changes that are coming.
It's such a Rubik's Cube, isn't it, to solve it? Because, it's so easy straight away to think, there's bound to be, this is so complex, and it feels like there's so much repetition. It feels like there's often a lot of wasted opportunities with teachers' time. Teachers are really busy, and then when they do get time, you're thinking, is this it? Is this the way to do this the best possible way? And I always find with CPD, when I speak to colleagues about this all over the place, there just ends up so much frustration around it, and people have so many legitimate different sort of things to vent on with it, and I nearly feel like that the whole thing itself needs disrupted, and it's sort of peeling that back a little bit. I mean, it's such an odd thing. When I qualified, as I was telling you last week, just as the revised curriculum was coming in, and beginning teachers were given, back then there must have been a bit more money for this type of thing, beginning teachers were given something like 5 or 6 days that were protected in your first year, as part of your induction journey. And it was kind of like, it was run by the kind of library board at the time, before they all kind of got amalgamated. And it was a bit of a menu, Kieran. So you'd sort of have these different courses running through the year, and one might have been on behavior management, or one might have been mental maths, or, and you sort of picked your 5 different things. And even that, like, that was absolutely better than nothing. That was probably really useful for a lot of beginning teachers, because up until then you're training with a teacher in your room, and people in and out, and all that kind of stuff. And September hits in that first year. If you're lucky to get a job, Northern Ireland's quite a competitive job market, so a lot of people didn't have that through the year anyway. They're maybe subbing and things like that, but that door closes, and you're kind of on your own in there with the class. So you welcome those days, and for a lot of teachers, it was even just getting to meet other people around the table and kind of see what was going on, different things like that. Really, really useful. But it all kind of feels like a wee bit of a stab in the dark in some ways, you get early years. I have a friend who's a teacher tutor in a school, and he kind of finds with the beginning teachers it goes kind of one of two ways. It's either like they're full of enthusiasm and they've got like 101 things that they're wanting to try because they've read about it loads, or they were told a little bit about it in their placement, or one of their mentor was maybe into it when one of their placement schools, and they want to try everything, but they can't do one thing well enough. So that trying to manage the expectations around that are maybe tough. And then there's the ones who just feel completely overwhelmed and don't know where to start, and nearly need to be told what their kind of approach is going to be in the early years. But I feel like there's something to work with beginning teachers. They've got that induction kind of template that gets them through their first year, and then there's like another 2 years after that. I think once you get established in a school, it gets a bit harder because you sort of end up, it's kind of just like when you get older, people assume that you're getting wiser as you get older. And for a lot of people, that hopefully is the case. But you are very much kind of left to your own devices. And if you're in a primary school, particularly, there's smaller environments. I know that post primary has its own challenges and opportunities, but primary school, in my experience, and that's all I can speak for, they're quite small environments. And unless you're moving on to go and be a vice principal or principal somewhere, you're going to be there for a long time. And kind of the years can roll in quite quickly, and you could start to lose perspective a wee bit. And I feel like the CPD can be such a wasted opportunity. I mean, recently the kind of schools in my area have got together a few times, and that's been it's been quite a useful thing to do, in the sense that they've decided to take their inset days on a given day, and there might have been 20-30 schools involved in that. But again, the chance that something is being picked there that just happens to be the right thing for a school at a time, it's quite slim. And it might be something that speaks into the needs of some schools at the time. It's a bit of a stretch at times, and I nearly feel like there should be a whole other way of looking at CPD and trying to get. I think if the Transform Ed opens up the way it's supposed to be, there've been promises around local hubs and research communities and things like that, things that we could really tap into and try and gather and pull together the best practice around. And I really do think there should be some sort of protected days and things where staff really have to, I don't know, pull together a lot of experience out there. And we're in a wee bit of it. You mentioned the Northern Ireland context. I felt for a wee while that Northern Ireland does feel in lots of ways a little bit cut off from a lot of the really good stuff that's been going on. We talked last week about exploring the potential of getting some people over, and even logistically that's not as easy as it would be for you traveling up somewhere else, so that makes it a wee bit more difficult. It feels like a lot of people are having to go and get the research basically from other countries, and it would be really good with Transform Ed. I feel like there's a really good opportunity to try to get tapped into that and get connected into some of those really top flight cognitive science things at the minute. And that, it just feels very new to people, I think, at the minute. I mean, we're talking a lot at the minute about the potential for retrieval to be lethally mutated and the different things around that can go wrong. And actually, I think we're not even as far as that. I wouldn't be spending too much time talking about the ways to get things like retrieval wrong at this point. I would actually be just really happy if a lot more schools were taking it on in the first place. I think that there's nearly an assumption that we're even a little bit further on the journey on that as we are. There are a lot of primary school teachers up and down the country, and loads of them who know absolutely nothing yet about the science of learning, about it. I mean, things like working memory, cognitive overload. This is very, very new for a lot of people here. And I feel like instinctively, really good teachers will be attuned a lot to that, and that will resonate really well. And they'll go, oh, yeah, I know what you mean. When you start talking about that, they'll get it. But I feel like we have a long way to go in terms of our CPD, and there are definitely solutions, but it just kind of feels like it's every man for himself a wee bit. And I think a lot of the success or the failure around CPD, it kind of is all basis on the school, and it shouldn't really be that way. And I feel like there are ways to get this right. A lot of money could be spent to kind of pull that together and have maybe someone accountable in certain areas for trying to make sure that there's a uniformity around a lot of that. And I don't have all the answers to that, but I do really feel like there needs to be something. I was speaking to a friend recently who's the MAS coordinator in his primary school, and he really struggles every year. It comes around the action plan time, and he said his experience of being a MAS coordinator hasn't been that hasn't been that positive. And I was asking why that was. And he said, because it's every year I have to think of something to to come up with as a target for the school, and I never really knew where to start. And for him, it was like, at the start of the year, I need to go to the principal and say, right, okay, I've looked at maybe what our standardized test scores are. I've looked at we did this last year, so what if? And you're sort of nearly kind of picking something. It might be shaping space one year for a school, or it might be right. Let's have a focus on measure or something, and the whole school kind of throw everything towards getting these really good displays on measure and putting that up on the Facebook accounts and have it, and it can be a little bit tedious, and you sort of sometimes think, to what extent are people just ticking a box? Are they just picking something as a focus nearly, where it's like, well, we don't really know what we need to do, so we'll just choose one thing and throw everything behind it, and that can't be the wrong answer if we all get behind it. And it can feel like a little bit of a stab in the dark at times. So I think a lot of it really depends on the school, and it depends maybe on the expertise of the staff in the school. Some of them have really got their ear to the ground in that stuff, and they're really aware of development. It just feels a wee bit like there's less about actual high quality teaching. It feels like maybe a school end up with their CPD, they choose something, and it just taking your turn. So it could be PE one year, and they choose, right, we're going to look at fundamental movements here up and down a school, and then the next year is maybe the world around us. It's going to be, let's make sure our topics are all lined up with different things, and it's just almost like taking a turn a little bit, instead of actually looking at how do we make everyone's classroom practice better, how do we make sure that that long-term change in memory can take place, and that children know things and can do things they weren't able to do the year before. And that's much harder, and I don't have all the answers to that, Kieran, but there are definitely a few things that could be changed.
The thing to take solace in is the fact that no matter where I am in the world, I see these things. It feels like there's a need for a higher level of strategic thinking on a number of levels, both at the school and in the governmental level, which potentially, sounds like it could be on its way. But also the codification of high quality teaching, which exists in many forms. And because that codification then allows you to break it down into like manageable steps, so that every teacher can be held to the same sort of expectations, because like in my experience, whenever things are broad, like we discussed broad objectives and things last week, when they're too open to interpretation, then some teachers get the stick and some get the carrot for maybe doing very similar things, but in different contexts. That makes sense. And I suppose the third thing to think about is that I don't think we've ever known as much about how schools improve and how teachers improve as we do now, and it's just about untapping that. And like, I know sometimes, like I mentioned last week, I didn't want to be the person who goes, oh, I'm back in my school, but the comparison with England can sometimes be a struggle. Like I know that in Wales, it's a big one because like Welsh government wants to be seen as a separate entity, and so it can't directly take from it. But there are things like the What Works Clearinghouse, which is almost like the American version of the Education Endowment Foundation. So there are sources out there that we can go to, but for there to be our own version of that in Belfast, or maybe on the North Coast in Ballymena, Ballymoney, where, like you said, we're going to get into research in a minute, where schools and teachers are taking responsibility for finding out what works in classes based on the best available evidence. Mm-hmm. I think it's definitely possible. And I think it feels like a natural next step after, the explicit articulation of, well, here's what you all deserve to learn. Here's how we can make sure your teachers get better, so that you can then all definitely learn this. So I think it is possible. It's probably a conversation for like a full conversation, but like there are, like if you look at the Education Endowment Foundation's sort of the different mechanisms, the core components, and the implementation strategies, you've almost got here's what I need to be thinking about long term. So like what I see here in England is sometimes reading is the priority, sometimes maths is the priority, sometimes writing's the priority, and then they switch when one set of stat scores goes down, the other one gets priority, and they so nothing's ever the priority for long enough. But the schools that do really well, everything, they have their core priorities, because you can't prioritize everything, and they almost say, okay, in 5 years' time, where do we want to be? And every decision you make about the training of your teachers and professional development is based on that. And I think in the first instance, you start with your core subjects, because they're ultimately the things that they are the gatekeepers. And then after that, you can then build. But to be honest, it sounds like lots of the other stuff is being done really well, and it's almost like can we almost bring the scales back in line with each other so we can balance the really high quality instruction with the really high quality pastoral, because like you said last week, they're not mutually exclusive. They are essentially the schooling of the child, So I feel you're almost like you're not despair, but I feel your frustration at the system, because there is a better way. But I think it feels like a logical next step.
It would be very unusual whenever schools take on something for a year, 3 years, whatever it is. It will be very much kind of right. This is the P coordinator, and here are some of the targets we're going to work at over the next couple of years. And usually maths or English will go in that in a particular year or in a cycle. But you don't really hear very often of just a school looking at its culture as a thing in and of itself, and you wonder how much would it be the rising tide a little bit if you just kind of focused on, like, what are we about, and never mind like just what is it in maths we want to get pulled up in a year or two. Like, yeah, as you mentioned there, you find an area that's maybe come through in standardized test scores, for example, or in if management are speaking to children, they feel like maybe it feels like problem solving is maybe just not as well attuned to other things. And if you just if you step back a wee bit, I wonder, I'm just thinking, because it's never really done. It's usually just like, here are the subjects that are going to be the focus for the school for the next year, 2 years, 3 years. And if you're getting inspected, everyone has to know that. Everyone has to know these sort of areas are, and all our staff meetings are coming inside that as well, where it's like, almost like a little bit of a round robin, where it's like, right, okay, this staff meeting is going to be on whatever it is, art or something, and then next one it's on to this and this. If there was another way, if you could look at the culture of a school and the expectations around what you want from the pupils as learners, what we are holding ourselves to in our standards, I wonder if you had a really good look at that and had time to really collaborate and go and look at what other schools were doing, and getting some top class teaching from the best, the likes of PEPs, from STEP labs, and all those sort of things that they'll talk a lot about culture. I wonder how much you could improve so much with that, especially in schools where they are having problems, where they're feeling that things aren't clicking well, or they're maybe struggling with classroom management, and maybe if they could fix a lot of that, maybe that would help very quickly bring everything up. I mean, I'm quite lucky in the school that I'm in. We get to spend all of our day teaching, but I have friends in other places where they're giving up 20, 30 minutes more than that every day sorting out issues. And that's for another conversation. That's not what we're talking about today. But I wonder if schools were a bit more free to choose things like culture and their routines and their identity as some of their targets. Could you maybe break ground in that?
I think you're spot on, because I think you don't get to do the long-term meaningful change without establishing culture. Like, if you talk to, like, I was actually editing a Sam Crome episode the other day, and he was talking about, let's fine go around the school and tell everybody that we're one big family and everything's fantastic and we're all working towards the same goal. But then you've also got 300 data points to enter in your 6 weekly whatever, and so you can't say one thing and do another. If you say, right, okay, we value your PD, we value the direction the school's going, then you do spend a lot of time. And like, it's the same with pedagogy. You don't go near pedagogy until you've got behavior management sorted, because you can have the best pedagogy in the world. If the kids aren't listening, if the kids aren't in a place where they feel safe and where they know where the boundaries are, well, you're just throwing their time away and your time away. So I think you're absolutely spot on. I think culture precedes all of this. And it's right, well, what conditions do we want to create for our teachers here? Because, like we said, you can reduce the amount of time you're working if you work smarter, if you think about only the things that are most likely to bring about the changes you want to bring about, rather than the performativity of data and the many of the other things we do in primary schools. I don't want to go down the pure academic, because there's lots of people writing academic papers about the business, like I say, the performativity of the education space and stuff. But it's true, there's so much stuff we do just so that we can show that we've done what we say we're going to do, whereas really the proof's in the pudding, especially with mathematics, because if you've taught, like you say, if you've taught equivalent fractions really well, then whenever it comes to ratio, they're halfway there before they even need to, whereas if you haven't, well, the wheels are coming off that bus pretty quickly, aren't they? How can we make research on learning more accessible and perhaps useful for busy class teachers? Because we've all got full days. We want people to engage with research on their terms. Is there anything you do that helps you to almost break things down or just even engage with it in the first place?
Yeah, it's such an interesting question because, first of all, I love it. So I love being able to read this stuff, and it's something I get a lot of enjoyment out of being able to do that. So I would find myself reading articles and following a lot of stuff pretty closely. And in my school, we're all really lucky because there's a great number of people who do actually find great joy in looking into this stuff in their own time. And that's something, I think we've talked about that before, Kieran, but that's something I wrestle with a lot because I don't think that a teacher should have to be doing that. And it's great when people want to. And I mean, I have a good example where there were 3 or 4 colleagues in my school that went down to a Research Ed event a couple of years ago down in Dublin, and that was a weekend thing. They went down on a Saturday, I think, just because they were interested. And that would be quite unusual. That because you think about that, you're spending your working week doing your job with the kids in front of you, 30 kids in front of you all day, every day. And the weekend's family time, and these people have their own families, but they're actually seeing a benefit in going down to learn about how they can be better at their jobs. And I think that stuff can be taken for granted a little bit because teachers are really busy. It's a really, really busy day. And it's one of those things I go back and forward a lot on this because, you think of other jobs out there. Like I have a lot of friends who are in the medical profession, and all the up-to-date training that they need to get is given to them. That's all baked into their jobs. It would kind of be unthinkable for them to have to give up their own free time to go looking out for opportunities to help them be better doctors, be better practitioners. Well, they're weak. They'll have days where they're, forward facing, speaking to patients and things, but they'll have part of their week as ring fence for training and for development and for reading and to be better at the jobs. Whereas in teaching, it's such a difficult one because you only got a very small amount of time to play with. What is it? Something like 5 or 6 inset days in a school, and that's back to us what we were saying a couple of questions ago, where you have to be very, very intentional, clear about how you want to use those days because they just evaporate really, really quickly, and if they're not used properly, then there's not a lot of value, and you are expecting people to go back and to take this on themselves. So yes, while I'm really interested, while I love all this, while I love sitting on a Monday evening chatting to you about this stuff because it makes me tick and I love it, and there's other people I know who also love it, I think we need to be giving this stuff to teachers, and it's not the job of a teacher to be sitting at night trying to decipher all these studies and to figure out what's worth pressing into and what is maybe better left for another year, put this in the back burner. And they shouldn't be deciding on all these things about their priorities for future development and so on. So I think, again, back to this whole idea of the whole sphere needing disrupted. I mean, I heard of one school where they opened up a management point. I thought this was a really good idea. They give a management point in their school specifically for teaching and learning. And I think that's great because it's back to the leadership thing as well, because you think in your head, if you're speaking to someone who isn't in a school, to be thinking, oh, well, that's the job of a head teacher, to be all over that and to be thinking of, cognitive science and to be thinking about all these retrieval and all that kind of stuff. And that's far too simplistic as well. I mean, you think of what it's not in place anymore, but there's a qualification for headship over here, and it was a course you took and you got an award, and so much of what that course is all about is preparing a head teacher for the busy demands of their job, namely how to deal with difficult parents, how to sorting out timetables and budgets and workmen coming to fix the fences and all the millions of things that can go wrong in a day. And they're busy on the ground. Teachers are busy in the classrooms, and it always feels there's these sort of areas of responsibility you get in schools where someone can have an area of responsibility and you get that promotion allowance, and it's never really been done before in primary, where someone is actually really looking after this whole metacognition, teaching and learning, and I think that would be a really good way in, because then they could be the gatekeepers. They could be all over that then, so they'll have their time allowance. Whereas at the minute in primary school, it's literally just carved up in the right. You are the art coordinator, you are the maths coordinator, you are the, and we can talk on and on about even whether that's possibly the best fit for how all that comes together. But if in having some allowance for teaching and learning, I mean, their job can be to do all that reading and disseminating all the current research best practice. Then they could be sending stuff out to their teachers once a week. Then it comes to thinking ahead for the inset days. They could be picking up the phone, speaking to their kind of counterparts in other schools in the local area. And then you could be off the races. Then you can start to think, right, okay, there's something here. We're going to, you could say, right, we're going to host all these teachers to our school on this day, and and it could be the first part of a series then. And then you can really start to dig deep into that. So yes, to come back to what you're asking, teachers are really busy. I don't think it's the job of a typical P4 teacher in Northern Ireland to have to be sitting reading through all these articles about how the brain works and about all that. It's great if they're interested in it. We would hope that there would be a lot of coverage in that in their training and that they are interested in it. But once you're in that job, you've 30 kids that you're accountable for, and I think it would be a really good thing if schools could kind of get ahead and maybe, I mean, it's like a management point or two. It's a drop in the ocean in terms of school budget, and that would be a really good way in, because then it's somebody's responsibility. You know what they say, when everybody's accountable, nobody takes it on. Whereas if this was treated like the way maybe assessment is treated in a school, I think there's a lot more potential for being able to do something really great with that. They could be sending out weekly newsletters to their staff. They could say, right, for the next time we meet, I want you all to read this chapter, and then we're going to go through that in the next meeting. And lots of these short video clips of best practice. You get loads and loads of things you could do with that, and I think that would be a really positive step forward. I would encourage them to read as much as they can, but again, that is relying on a lot of goodwill there, Kieran. And unfortunately, at the minute, there's so much of that already in our profession, So, but whereas I think that's a good idea forward, especially like head teachers. It's the sort of thing as well. If you go into a post-primary school, you'll have principal right at the top, and then usually if the school's big enough, there'll be two vice principals. One typically will be in charge of curriculum, and one will be for pastoral needs. And primary schools just aren't built that way. They don't have that infrastructure, and it just ends up that leadership end up so busy on just having to run the school, having to make sure everything works. And I don't think it's on them either to be having the time to keep abreast of all these developments. Things come out so quickly, and it's something. There's a lot of discussions, I think, and after Transform Ed starts to get implemented, I've been told that there will be something around kind of hubs of resourcing and things like that. So I am quite positive and enthusiastic about that moving ahead.
I mean, like as someone who enjoys reading research and going to research ed and stuff, but I know that it's not certainly among the primary teachers, it's not something that happens all the time. So, but I think if that model were to exist, because I think you're right. I think head teachers are almost like civil servants, but they don't enjoy the flexi time that normal members of the civil service would get. They've got so much bureaucracy, so much safeguarding, so much external stuff to deal with, that having someone makes total sense. Because I think because the big thing is autonomy. That's normally what it comes down to. That's normally why there's governmental decisions not to mandate one way of teaching, because of the perhaps the arguments from the unions and perhaps even just teachers in general not wanting to get on board with it. But if it's teacher led and if it's teacher driven, but actually we can save a lot of time because there's lots of conversation we don't need to have, then I think that would be a fantastic model to have. And I think for the person who got to be almost the bridge between research and the classroom, what a fantastic career opportunity that is as well. Because I mean, the person will be doing what they loved and being able to contribute massively to the school as well. So so I can totally see where you're coming from.
It's the follow-up as well. Like quite often, and I don't blame management for this, because everyone in lots of ways feels like they are operating on a sort of a bit of a tick sheet at times. And a lot of that is to kind of appease the next rung up the ladder. So it feels like in lots of ways teachers are having to go through a lot of hoops to appease possibly management in schools, who are only doing that really because they feel like that accountability with um obviously the external bodies and things. But a lot of it then you sort of think, right, has this been done primarily with the intention of improving teaching and learning, or is it kind of a wee bit of a box ticking exercise? I mean, you get these courses sometimes that people put on, where we've had several in the last number of years, and there could have been upwards of 20, 30 schools represented. And, in lots of ways, right, you go to the day and you take your notes, you go through the presentation, and the stuff's all emailed out and so on. Um, and, it could be good, bad, or indifferent. And you're maybe taking little notes, and you're whispering your colleague beside you, oh, right, we must try that out. That's something that we need to look at next year. Or, yeah, we'd love to do this. And like, it's back to this sort of working memory thing again. Like, how often does that happen? We joked about this in the staff room recently, where so often um you come across these good ideas and things, and without the follow up, without the time to digest that, it kind of gets lost because you're back at your desk on Monday morning, and so on. And without that, almost, I don't mean accountability in a sort of in a stick sense that you were talking about. It's more of this need to actually think, well, what have we done with that? Nearly, it's like, is there another day the next month where we actually start to plan for how we embed some of the stuff? Because otherwise it becomes very ad hoc then, and you maybe get a couple of teachers who took a lot out of it, and they're firing into it, and they're, like, great, we're starting to embed this, and we're looking at how we can change this from last year to fit this in, and so on. Or you have some people who say, oh yeah, that was pretty good, I must get around that, and then that's gone. Like, that's completely out of their bandwidth, because they're on to something else. And I just feel like without much of a follow up, things end up just, right, we've done that. We've done that, and that would be my big worry. I don't. Whenever it comes to us, all starting to take on, issues of retrieval and spacing and looking into all these types of things. I really hope that the time is taken to make sure we get this right, and that it doesn't become this thing that, right, retrieval, great, we've done that now. We know what that is, and almost because it kind of feels very familiar to people, and they hear, they go, yeah, that's kind of what in your mind you like to think you do anyway. So when you hear that kind of stuff, people will most likely, they're very unlikely. People are unlikely to hear the stuff and go, that's not at all how I teach. I feel like once that stuff gets presented to you, it's so intuitive, and you feel like you've seen this stuff before, you've experienced it, and you go, oh yeah, that's done. We know that. I've been doing this, or I'm just going to do X, Y, Z, and that's me up to date with that. And then that's retrieval done, tick, and then that's the next thing done, tick, and it can actually be very easy to miss a lot of that. And I guess, again, it's just very symptomatic of teacher and school type problems, where just when something gets brought in, we just jam things full, like that cupboard that just won't close. And it's the same with planners. When planners, they get developed, and the evolution of the medium term planner in its current form, it's like the late stage, isn't it? It's just everything you could possibly think of is now in that. So it used to be maybe just a series of learning intentions. To then it was like, oh, that's not adaptive enough, or that's not. So then we chatted about this last week. We end up having to put, what's your differentiation? If you put that in your 6 weekly planner, or what's your, is your classroom assistant signed that, or have you got all the strategies, and have you got all the activities in that, have you got your reflections, have you got all that? And the danger is that we just completely overload it, and it becomes meaningless. And I would far rather schools pull everything back and maybe just focus on, it sounds really radical, because like school development plans are quite busy documents, and maybe they need to be, I don't know, I haven't written one. But just choose one or two things and get really, really good at that one or two things, and see what that looks like after a year. Like, maybe your school get really good at questioning. Like, maybe you were able to walk into any one of the 14 classrooms, depending on the size of school, and there was a wee bit of coherence, and you could just kind of see that. You could experience this kind of standard and this real reflective, adaptive teaching, and maybe they get really good at those one or two things. And then the end of the year, it's like, well, what if we push that a little bit? And we start looking at the show me boards and how you tie that in with your I do, we do, you do, and your worked examples. And maybe after that you start looking at your non-examples. I mean, that's something I'm only now starting to get into and learn about. Again, intuitively, it felt like I was okay on that. Like it felt when I started hearing about non-examples, I was like, this kind of sounds familiar, because I knew there was just something about that sounded really interesting. And maybe accidentally we do that. Guys, here's what I want you to do. Careful you don't do this, or something like that. And you maybe get that kind of right by accident a few times. And that's kind of been my experience. But it's only now that I've properly got the name for that and read on that, and really looked at ways to explain that and how specific you have to be with your non-examples. That really blew my mind, because that's something I had really never encountered before. And that's a really big deal. And that's something that so many teachers have been really into for quite a long time now, but I hadn't been, and most people I'd spoken to hadn't really been either. But that could be something that a school might, have as one of their big aims for a year. How do you get that right in what you're telling the children not to do, or what a parallel line doesn't look like? So I think the problem is that we often just put too many things into things in our CPD, but it's maybe quite shallow, and there's maybe not a whole lot of ways to measure it in its effectiveness. Whereas I feel like if you just choose a couple of things, I'm really just thinking off the top of my head here, Karen, and I don't have all the answers to this. Like I'm sure plenty of school leaders would be able to say that's not practical because blah blah blah, and that's fine. Listen to that. But if you only had a couple of things and went really deep on it, you would really hope that would be apparent then when you went into those classrooms, and you could actually tangibly feel that in the atmosphere. And then you go into another classroom and you got it again, and that you build that as part of your culture, part of your identity. When you get the knock on your door from the external body, you're able to say, like, this is something that we've put an immense amount of time into, and we're really proud of this. And we have deliberately not gone for the typical things. Like, there's a lot of, we've talked about that before, there's a lot of fads at the minute. There's a lot of things that people feel pressured to press into. And there are other ways to do things, but it does take a lot of thought, and maybe take some mistakes to get made along the way too. And I think there's a lot of fear. That's the other thing. There's a lot of fear out there, and people worry about competition as well, because like we've got a situation in a lot of towns where there aren't the same birth rates that there used to be. So you've got schools feeling like they're in competition with each other, and that's a big thing too, where it's almost like an arms race, and people are feeling they need to keep up because the school down the road have, I don't know, an anti-bullying ambassador, a well-being ambassador, all these different things, and then we need that, and then that's it feels like that's your CPD gone, because so many teachers are having to spend every minute of their planning time on all these other initiatives. They're not able to spend enough time on the stuff that we're talking about, thinking deeply, about education. But I do think we'll get there. I do feel quite good about it.
We make education a zero-sum game. It's a race to the bottom more than anything, so the more we can do to stop schools from feeling like they're in competition with each other, then the better, because basically you want to pay it forward for everybody else in your community. And I think you're like naturally self-deprecating. I suppose it's the way of the world and in our neck of the woods. But you keep saying, sort of pushing away any notions of expertise, but actually what you've described there, I think it sounds like the approach, because like if we look at almost like, well, what's the challenge most schools are facing? A significant proportion of their kids can't remember what they were taught 2 months ago. So what are the three things that are going to help us improve that? Well, our mode of instruction. So like you said, worked examples, the routines for the utilization of whiteboards. The big thing is, like, end of term, we've got decision fatigue. We want to be the most effective version of ourselves, even when we're exhausted. So you put those routines in place, and you will default to that. So you got your worked examples, you've got your, suppose your show me boards will be your formative assessment, and then your retrieval will be, well, let's make sure this sticks. And I think, like, where we instinctively feel, oh yeah, we do that, I think, that's where the risk, for a lot of teachers, the risk is there for the mutation, because actually the research is really clear. And I often find there's some really like if you begin with a counterintuitive, then you give the teachers a shock to the system. Like the best time to try and recall something is the moment before forgetting. So, I mean, even when I was at university, I would cram the night before a test, thinking that this was somehow me bringing all this stuff into my memory. I mean, at the time, it was long and short. It was short and what was it? It wasn't long term. It wasn't working memory. It was short term memory, long term memory.
Yeah.
And I thought, right, I'll cram the night before. That's me. And showing teachers that cramming is ineffective as a long term sort of agent of change, I think can really be a shock to the system. And then when you outline things like the new theory of disuse and stuff, and go, actually, right, okay, there's a way we can put a routine in place for retrieval practice. So they're like those core principles, like the almost exponential. We're getting twice as far away from the last time we tried to recall this. The fact that the recalling makes a new, stronger memory. If we adhere to those principles, it's the active retrieval. If we have teach assistants best will in the world, they're just trying to help, but sometimes they'll just tell the answer. That's not what we want. Cueing is a way to mediate those desirable difficulties or to make difficulties desirable. But, if we have all those things in our mind, then we can identify because you say, oh, it's just look at the three things. If we think about how all those things can be broken down into component parts and put it together as a routine, which becomes a behavior, or a habit then becomes a behavior, you've got 4 years worth of real work there, I think, but it's the highest leverage stuff. So it's the stuff that's going to make a difference, especially to those kids who need it, those kids who are perhaps not making the expected standard, whatever that measurement might be at the end of primary school, because we know that more often than not, they're still not there at GCSE. And that's when their contribution to the world and when they're what they can expect to receive back in remuneration. So you can say you're not an expert as much as you want, but I think you've hit the nail on the head a number of times, and no more so in this, because I think that's the model for school leadership. So you might be applying for headships sooner rather than
later. Thank you for that, Kieran. Yeah, but it's getting the time, and it seems like such a I don't know, square peg round hole, because you can't really do much about the time. The time is the time, and you can't create that time out of nowhere. But I mean, I was even reading recently about you were saying there about retrieval and not forgetting, and I only figured that stuff out in the last couple of years. Like again, back to what you're talking about, cramming, and I would have had sort of this idea, if you just keep going over and over it, then eventually it sticks and they get better at it. And there's maybe something to that, but it's only just in the last couple of years of reading about that forgetting curve, and even just that almost that magic seems to take place in that pulling it out. It's that it's as you say, they are just at that cost, just at that point of forgetting it. There's just a little bit of magic sauce and them having to pull that out, and then they start forgetting it again, and then you draw that out again, and that becomes like concrete. And those are the things that once you know that, you take that for granted. And it's a wee bit like what Christine Council was saying in the curriculum talk she did with us, this idea of the curse of knowledge. And like we could be guilty of that ourselves now, because we find this stuff out and we assume that every teacher knows that. And like a couple of years ago, I didn't know that. And there is this expectation that we have an absolute duty to make sure that for this, and this is such an exciting time with Transform Ed coming in with a new curriculum being phased in the next couple of years. This is absolutely the time to get pedagogy right, to get teachers really up and into cognitive science, because it just felt like you were just going through a lot of emotions before. And I know certainly in my training, I'm sure you would agree in yours, like there was not that focus on any of this. And it's really exciting. There's so much. I mean, even I've chatted to you before about how I've always found it really perplexing how the P7s in our school always tend to test better in the standardized scores whenever that comes around. And again, it's only recently I'm learning more about the testing effect and things like that. And I was even reading up on like different ways to structure how you facilitate your curriculum. Like the idea, obviously we know about the spiral curriculum and so on. But recently I was reading, it was actually one of Naveen's articles, who was in our drafting group, and she'd written about the Strand curriculum. And I don't know again if that's something you've spent much time on, but I assume that was just very similar to the Spiral curriculum, not realizing fully what that was. This idea that you're constantly coming back to lots of things in very small doses almost every day. So like in a maths lesson, a particular day, you're maybe 5, 10 minutes on this, 5, 10 minutes on this. And, I sort of feel like in lots of ways, accidentally, people can get that right, particularly if they're teaching in a year group where there is something like a CEAG test coming up that year, or your SATs over with you and so on. And, when would teachers get the chance to actually think about that? Unless they stumbled into that by accident or they were spending time reading up on that. And it just feels like it's such a deep, it's such a deep well. And the problem, and again, we touched on this last week, teachers they're working memory, if we'll use that metaphor, they're just full on admin and bureaucracy. And I feel like if we could get the CPD right here with us, we could leverage this curriculum like so much further if you were able to get these steps in place. You mentioned there about the kids who just in the class maths are not going to get it, because we now know, of course, that everything about maths is sequential and it builds upon the last thing. And if they don't get it, they end up just moving through the conveyor belt, don't they? They just go up the year groups until they're out. So it does feel very pressing. It feels really important. And I think that the CPD is kind of the foundation of this. And I don't think it has been really front and center very much. I think it's just one of these things everybody knows is important, but doesn't really know how to fix it and doesn't really know how to get it right. And there's probably a little bit of collective apathy about that, or some people just think, people assume everybody's getting experience. And I think it's really system dependent, and it depends really where you are. And it shouldn't be, it should be something that we should all be really involved in. So I think if we could collect resources in some way and get that stuff out there, people, even the likes of getting people to come in and see each other as well, come into different schools. I mean, that's something that doesn't happen, just get some time to go. I mean, it wouldn't be that hard to work that out. Get your class covered by somebody else and on a day that worked, and use some of your time to go and see a local school, go and see what they do for how they use their visualizer or their OneNote, or how they do their show me boards and all that kind of stuff. Like, I feel like there's a lot that can be solved with this if we get it right.
Like for me, that's why this podcast exists. That's why I know a lot of podcasts exists. There's the Knowledge for Teachers podcast and that Brendan Lee does in Australia. They would have been having similar conversations maybe the last 5 or 6 years. And there's almost like this discrepancy or disparity between the top-down dissemination of knowledge and teachers on the ground feeling, actually, you shouldn't have to learn this for yourself, because we've known about the test and effect since 1962, 1963. Why we're still in 2026 having people randomly find out about it on their own shouldn't be the way. So, I think that's what certainly why TDAPA exists, because to try and act as that bridge between. But like, where do you go for inspiration, and how do you keep on improving your own practice?
For me, I find the research ed movement really transformative. I find that really useful. My wife worked in a school that they held their own event in their school over here a couple of years ago. By that point, I had already had a copy of Tom Sherrington's Dissemination of the Rosenshine Principles, and I loved that little short book. It was just, it opened up so much in my mind. It was so transformative for me. Then things lined up pretty well for me. That the Research Ed event happened here in Belfast, where a number of people were involved in that, and I guess for me that felt like that opened up a lot of different channels in the research and in the education I didn't know existed, basically. So yeah, from that I got into some podcasts like this podcast. Barton Miles is another one that I would have been listening in to and developing. And then just getting books recommended to me. Friends would say, "Oh, you need to read this. You need to read this book. Check this out." For me as well, I know it's pretty well known by now, but Doug Lemov's book, Teach Like a Champion, I think it's absolutely super, and there's so much to learn from it. It's such a big book. There's so much in it, and I think for beginning teachers especially, like that should be mandatory reading. Like there's so many gems in that, and things again, like the likes of that CPD Academy, the InnerDrive one. It is a really good resource. But again, nobody knows about that over here. I know that some of the post-primary schools have got subscriptions to those models and things, but again, it just feels like the primary is just a little bit out of that. It just doesn't feel like there's enough primary teachers even know anything about this type of stuff. And yet a lot of those videos, those little kind of snack size videos they offer, have like quite young children in the videos. Like they're not GCSE age children. Like a lot of it's really appropriate at key stage 2, key stage 1, and so on. It's just that it just tends to be out of our sphere at primary, and I just don't really get why that is. Even I'm talking to you about research ed there, but most of the experts that you encounter, most of the people who have got the platforms and have written the books, and so I mean, I have to say, Kieran, you're one of the few primary guys that I know of, because most of the time you're having to read something that's been written primarily for the audience of post-primary sector, and then having to kind of distill that or to adapt that or tweak that or to think about to what extent is that applicable to my domain. And there should be a lot of that would be applicable, absolutely. But it's not really written for primary teachers in mind. And I know there's a lot of stuff out there, but it just feels like the highest profile and the stuff that I feel tends to be the highest quality tends to be real sort of subject specialists who are writing from post-primary background and writing for post-primary audience. And I think I've heard a lot of people saying the same. I mean, most primary teachers here wouldn't be able to put they wouldn't be able to put their hand to a lot of the research in cognitive science. I wouldn't say, and it just feels quite insurmountable, I think, for a lot of people. But I think we can get this. I think we can get this sorted. It wouldn't have to be heaven and earth being moved, but I think the profile of primary needs to be raised a lot. I really do. If you had people just being aware of all these things, I mean, I don't know if you saw recently, I think with Step Labs released that document with all of the interventions that that one came where all
it's excellent, those fidget spinners.
but in many ways it was sort of funny to read it, but you were also going, well, hang on a wee minute now, what about all of that then? What about all the the stuff that everyone was pushed on about making sure that the classrooms ready, and the overlays. I mean, that was a big thing for a lot of schools. I mean, we didn't go down that route, but I know a lot of schools did. They got really into this idea, the fidget spinners or some version of it. And then this comes out, which is there's been studying this. It's come out to show that actually the jury's pretty out in this, and if anything, it looked like sort of mild disadvantage in having those things in place. And then I was like, well, hold on, what about all that? What about all that time? What about all that? We're talking again CPD. Think of all the hours spent on people having to train their staff and making sure that your schools were resourced for all these things, and someone's job to purchase those or to make sure they're available in the classrooms and all these things. And then we've got a really high quality report that says actually not only is it pretty useless, it's actually got a potential for harming the learning of pupils in the classroom. And again, that's why we all need to have good quality CPD and be aware of this stuff. But again, it shouldn't be up to class teachers to go off and find this stuff out. They shouldn't have to go and discover this by themselves.
I think that's also why your research gatekeeper, your person who's responsible for teaching and learning, is a leadership position, like you said, having a leadership point, because on some level you need to be advising the head teacher about things that are likely to be huge waste of time. Like in my last couple of roles, I've been like deputy head, but also like leading maths across 3 schools, and it wasn't just maths that I was advising on. I was all like, well, actually, I've been reading a lot. I've had a lot of time to learn a lot of research, and this suggests that we shouldn't probably spend our time in this direction, that direction, or the other direction. And so I think that almost ties everything together that we've been talking about this evening, because I think if someone can be there to not necessarily bend the ear, but to be almost like the conciliary of the head teacher and say, actually, there could be a lot of time and money wasted on this. I've recently spent time on like an AI coaching website, and there was a page called Evidence, and it was all anecdotal, and there was lots of money at stake. And we know anecdotal evidence is an oxymoron. So there should be someone who any sort of investment that you're looking to make on a school level, your teaching and learning, your evidence informed person should be going, right, okay, let's
Yeah.
really take a look at this. Are there any randomized control trials?
Yeah. Yeah.
Are there the signposts of, like, because that PEPS and Step Lab and Ambition and stuff, they're all looking at they're trawling through thousands and thousands of bits of information to get to where we are with that. And so you can trust them. So almost having those people, but equally the person in school, knowing they can trust, and because that trust is everything. And I hope that we don't lose that in the age of AI, where it seems like everything's up for grabs and the critical eye is not being put on. But that again is definitely, for another day, because you've rounded everything off really nicely. And it's in fact of how important this is, because not only will it make sure kids have the best education possible, but you save thousands of hours and pounds on things that are totally ineffectual.
We'll save AI for another.
I need to fully form my thoughts on that, because I'm getting really tired of it very, very quickly. But I also feel like a man shouting at the clouds, the way it's at Mole Man.
That's the hill you're going to die on.
It might have to be. We'll see what happens. We can go on for another 3 hours, Matthew, but it has been an absolute pleasure. Also, to say thank you very much for joining me again.
Thank you, Kieran. Love being on that. Really, really good experience. And we'll chat soon.
And everyone at home, until next time, thanks for listening.